put a punch hole here. We think we want to put one at the apex, right? What else do we think we want to mark here? How would I know where these darts begin or end?
Notches.
Notches. So you guys all have a notcher now? Yeah? So I'm going to notch this first, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about where the punch holes go. But notice I'm notching them both at the same time. I'm notching both sides while it's still shut. This saves me time. Make sure that everything got notched and that they're the same. Okay? So I'm going to be notching on each dart leg at the angle of the leg. Okay? I'm going to be centering that little rounded slot on the line. I don't want to notch on one side of the line or the other. I want to split the line with the notcher. Now these notchers don't always like dot paper. They kind of get gummed up in there. So sometimes I'll put some extra paper to make it thicker, and I'll notch through extra paper at the same time. Or a scrap of manila. If I stick a scrap of manila under there, it'll more likely cut. Okay, so I'm going to kind of center this over that dart leg line and notch through. Okay, so I want to notch my dart legs. What else do you think I want to notch? Side seam. Just as a reminder, because we know we're going to be doing a 1/2 inch there, but maybe you're not going to be sewing this. Maybe somebody else is going to be sewing this. We're going to notch to let them know what sort of seam allowance it is. So I'm going to be notching at the top and the bottom of my side seam. And again, I'm going to notch centered over the line, not to one side or the other. So top and bottom of side seam. Okay, so this lets them know there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance right here. And when we go to sew, we'll start at one notch and we'll sew to the opposite notch. Okay? Now, you might be inclined to also notch this intersection and this intersection, or this side of the corner too. If I notch both sides of the corner, what's going to happen is I'm going to have this really weak little rectangle here. And that little weak rectangle, after using this pattern once, is going to tear off. Okay? So we're never going to notch both sides of a corner. We're going to notch the side that we sew first. So we're going to be sewing our side seam before we put in our sleeve, so we're going to be notching that side seam first. Okay? So in general, we're going to be notching, unless there's some other reason to do otherwise, we're going to be notching the top and the bottom of the side seam. So write that down if you haven't. We're going to be notching both sides of the shoulder seam, because that has to get sewn before we put in the sleeve. And if you're ever notching wherever there's like a short little 1/4 inch seam allowance, don't do the full depth of the notch. Make sure that notch stays within your seam allowance. So I'm doing a smaller little notch at that side. But the side where there's a 1/2 inch, I'm letting it take the full notch depth. Okay, so both sides of the seam allowance on shoulder and side seam. I'm not notching the waist. I'm not notching the armhole. Just the shoulder, just the side seam. I will be putting a notch at the center front waist. And I could wait until I open it, or I can do it right now while I'm thinking about it. I'm going to be putting a notch at the center front waist because something is getting sewn there. Right? We're going to be sewing a skirt to this. I'll wait till it's over. We're going to be sewing a skirt to this, and it's nice to have a notch at the centers when you're connecting two things. I'm not sewing anything up here to the neckline. I'm going to leave that alone. I don't want to weaken that already small, really curvy area, so I'm not going to put a notch there. But wherever I'm sewing something, I will put a notch at the centers. When I get to the skirt, I'll be putting a notch on the skirt at the center front in the same location, so those two notches will match up. But if there's a hem, I'm not going to notch the center front of a hem because nothing's getting sewn there. Okay? All right, so let's talk about punch holes before I open this up. One other thing, there will be a notch in here somewhere. We don't know where it is yet. You might be inclined to put a notch at that mid-armhole pin. It's not going to be there. we're going to be drafting a sleeve on Friday, and the sleeve is going to tell us where this notch is going to be. So don't put it in there. You're going to see that there's going to be a notch on the final patterns in the book, but we're not there yet. Okay? All right, so how do we punch? Well, you should all have an awl, okay, and you can either punch a hole with an awl, or I don't know if Miss Poteet showed you guys this screw punch. This is a really cool tool. It makes perfect little circular holes. I use it mostly on manila. I don't usually bother with it on dot paper because, again, it just munches it up and wrecks it. But on manila, I love a screw punch. It makes a really nice hole. A hole is not a dot on the paper. I get a lot of people putting a dot on the paper and circling it with red and calling that their punch hole. That's not a hole. I want to actually see through the paper. We want to be able to trace in that hole with a pencil or a marker, right? So we are going to be making a hole. We are going to be making something called a sloper. And a sloper, so eventually down the road this weekend, you're going to be making a sloper out of manila paper, not dot paper. You'll be turning this in, but not for a grade. This is just for me to see that you did the steps to get to that sloper in the first place. So we've got two different kinds of patterns that we're going to be working on this week. One is this first paper pattern. It's kind of a rough draft. We use it to cut out our sample to make sure it worked. If our sample had some problems, we would go back to this pattern and fix it. So this is kind of our rough draft. This first paper pattern has seam allowance on it, just like we put in here. This first paper pattern is something we're sewing from, okay? If I am sewing from a pattern, do I actually want a hole at the vanishing point? If I put a hole on my pattern, the person cutting might think, oh, that's okay, I'll be putting a hole on my actual fabric. And if I put a hole at the vanishing point on the actual fabric and I sew to that hole, there'll still be a hole showing, right? So how did we mark our darts before on finished patterns, on something we sew from?
Half-inch below.
Yes. So I don't want to be putting a hole on any final pattern we sew from or any actual sewn item. I don't want to put a hole at the vanishing point of the dart because that will leave a hole in the garment. Okay? So this is a pattern we're sewing from, right? We're going to be cutting out a sample from this pattern. I'm not going to be putting a hole there. I'm going to be putting a hole 1/2 inch inside that vanishing point. And that is going to be going along the center line. So I've got the center fold here from where I had it folded before. I'm going to draw in my center line so I know where the center is. And I'm going to mark 1/2 inch down from my vanishing point, and I'm going to be putting a hole, a real hole. A hole that is big enough for a pencil tip or a pen tip to go through. Okay? So it should be an obvious hole as opposed to a small pinprick hole. Something that a pencil tip or pen tip can actually go in and mark. Okay? So a real hole. And how are we going to show that this real hole means something? Circle it in red. So if this were red, I would do a nice big circle around it.